Hey guys, welcome back to Petronas Photography. Color science. Two words that strike fear into the heart of any Canon user thinking about making that big jump to Sony. Well, today, maybe we can answer some of those questions. I don't think I can really put the issue to rest fully, but what I can do is show you some comparisons between a Sony A7R2 and a Canon 6D and a Sony A7 III and my Canon 6D, and let you make up your own mind. I am a Canon shooter, and I wanted to see what the real-world implications were for color science with a Sony camera, especially before I make a multi-$1,000 leap into an entirely new system. So my goal was to see really how the skin tones differ between Canon and Sony, not just color in general, but skin tones, because that's really a core issue for a lot of us that do portrait work or video work or anything like that, where we have people in the frame. And I do that quite a bit, so I really wanted to see what I was up against, what I was looking at. But first, let's talk about methodology, because that is very important as to determining what's really the difference between colors and camera bodies. If I showed you a really blue photo like this, and then a really nicely balanced image like this, and said, "See, I told you Sony's color sucks," the very first thing you should say is, wait a minute, color balance both of these images first and then let me look at them. What I'm looking at is not the difference in color science. What I'm looking at is a difference in color settings. And settings are adjustable. So what we want to see is what's not adjustable. We want to see what's intrinsically core to the color science of Sony versus Canon. So we're going to match settings, but that presents a little bit of a problem. Now, if you watch other YouTubers that have taken a stab at this experiment, what you'll notice is that they usually try to set the color balance equally in all their cameras. That is, they put them all at 5500 Kelvin or at 5000 Kelvin, something like that. The problem is not all 5000 Kelvin settings are created equal. 5000 Kelvin is not the same, especially between Canon and Sony. Those are not equal white balances. They don't even look close to the same. So to match them, I'm going to visually match them rather than just match them by the numbers. When I visually matched these images, the difference between a Sony A7R2 and a Canon 6D was anywhere from 8 to 1100 Kelvin difference. The Sony had to be about 1000 Kelvin warmer than the Canon just to look the same on my screen. Now on the Sony A7 III, it was a lot better. The Sony A7 III is only about 500 Kelvin cooler than the Canon, so you only need to warm it up by about 500 Kelvin past the 6D. So if your 6D is set at 5000 Kelvin, your Sony A7 III would need to be set at 5500. Not too bad. Now you'd think a fairly objective standard like 5500 Kelvin being daylight balance would be universal, but if you really want your mind blown, go watch Tony Northrup's video about ISO, because it's kind of the same. Not all ISO 100 is created equal across all camera brands. So I'm going to show you 8 images in pairs of 2. In each case, the exposure is exactly the same, and if it was a little bit different, I tweaked it in Photoshop with just very minor slider adjustments to make the brightness and the contrast be roughly the same. These were very minor tweaks. But when it comes to color, the only tweaks I did were in Adobe Camera Raw using the temperature and the tint sliders, and that's it. No weird curves, no color shifts, no trickery of any kind. Now, all of these images are in 4K, so feel free to blow this video up to full screen, pause it as you need to, and pixel peep away. Take a look at the colors mostly. Now, I did adjust the size of the images to be relatively the same to each other. That way, the higher resolution of the Sonys didn't give them away by simply the virtue of the fact that they're larger. But enough of all that. Take a look at the images and see if you can guess which one is which. So there's a couple of takeaways here, and the first is that these images edited to be fairly flat like this are very close. They're not the same, but they are close. The goal here was to make the images look the same with as few edits as possible, because my theory is if you get to a good starting place with a file, it's a lot easier to take it to a good end, to a good final edit that you're happy to give a client, or that I would be happy to give to a client. And the whole goal here was not to spend too much time sitting there peeping about color. Now, some images took a little bit more time time because I was chasing pinks around back and forth between midtones and highlights and trying to find the best balance. And in some cases, I don't think I did as good a job as I probably could have, but I did the best that I could for a short amount of time. Again, the goal here was not to spend 20 minutes per image trying to make them look the same. Now, all that said, as close as these images are, I think there's differences. In fact, there's definitely differences, and there's more differences between the A7R2 and the 6D than there are between the 6D and the A7 III. The A7 III has definitely got some improved color science going for it. Now, I promised you some answers, and here they are. With our young bearded friend here in the shade on a porch, the Sony is on the right and the Canon is on the left. With this guy leaning up against the truck with his bandana, the Canon is on the left and the Sony is on the right. In this picture, the Canon is on the right and the Sony is on the left. And in this picture, the Sony is again on the left and the Canon is on the right. Now let's go through these picture by picture. Now, in my opinion, none of these photos are bad. Some are just better than others, but let's look at the A7R2 files first. In this shot, I used the 70-200. The Sony is of course on the right and the Canon's on the left. I shot this at 2.8 and he's got some nice window light going because we shot on a porch in the shade. You'll notice that the Sony's a little bit greener, but if you look at the skin tones, you notice that they're fairly close. The difference is when you look at his shirt. The Sony to me looks more neutral, like a more true gray and a true dusty blue. On the left, the Canon looks almost more purpley. But despite that, his skin tones again look relatively similar. Not nearly as much difference between his skin tones as there are between his shirt tones. Really quick, I do apologize that this is not in the best quality, but this is an edited image of both of these side by side, where I upped the contrast, I pushed things a little more, and I kind of edited them separately in a style that I would usually edit a photo in. And you can see that the differences tend to pop out a little bit more when you push the files for more contrast, clarity, and all that good stuff. In this shot, again, the Sony's on the right and the Canon's on the left. This was also shot with my 70-200. This is very different from the last guy. The last guy was fairly pale complexioned. This guy has a little bit more of a red complexion. He's more Irish. And this was shot in broad, harsh daylight. The other guy was shot in shade, so this is a very different skin tone in very different lighting. Now notice that the skin tones are very similar to each other, but the truck tones are not. Again, the Sony's on the right, Canon on the left. The Canon seems to have a little bit more authentic redness to the truck, or more punchy redness, I should say, whereas the Sony has a little bit more of a brownish tint, or a little bit more muted reds to it. As a side note, I'll point out that I actually used the star on his bandana as a white balance point, and that got me close, but it did not get me exactly matched. I did have to visually match these despite using the dropper tool on what is objectively the same white point in both photos. Now in this shot of my girl, the Canon is on the right and the Sony is on the left. And you can tell that there's not much difference at all, but this is because we're looking at the Sony A7 III. Now I lit this with a 22-inch beauty dish and a Neewer flash from the left. And I did botch the exposure a little bit. You can tell that it's a little too hot. So I did have to bring the highlights down on both images. Like I said, the goal was to make them look the same, not to perfectly edit them. I did botch this a little bit, but as you can tell, the skin tones here are very, very close indeed, because the Sony A7 III has seen a huge improvement to the way that color is handled. Finally, this is my brother-in-law, who is half Latino, so he has a little bit more of an olive complexion, and again, the lighting is different. This is just natural window light on Christmas morning. The Sony is on the left and the Canon is on the right. Now, if you look at the carpet and the bokeh in the background there, the Canon has a little bit more green in the carpet and the Sony on the left has a little bit more pink, kind of reversing the roles that we've seen so far. But in spite of that, you notice that the skin tones are very, very close together despite what some of the other colors are doing in the background. I will say that I think a lot of these things could be tweaked using the color balance feature in Photoshop. But on the other hand, that would take a lot of time, and the goal here is to see if you can just pick up an A7 III or an A7R2 and immediately get good results and immediately get usable skin tones right out of the box. There's one more thing I'll mention about landscapes, and that is when I shoot landscapes, sometimes I like to shoot black and white, and I like to punch the sky down really dark, almost a red filter or an infrared look. The Canon 6D files don't really handle this punching that well. They kind of get a little bit weird. You start to see artifacts, you start to see pixelation and just other oddities popping up. The Sony A7 III files handled this very, very well. I'm not sure exactly what's going on there, but I can definitely say that the Sony handles that level of editing a lot better than the Canon does. The truth is that as a Canon shooter, I've got some concerns about jumping to Sony, but not about color science. Not after this. I'm very happy with the color science and the results I got out of a Sony A7 III. I got great results. I think you can too, especially if you're willing to shoot raw, start with a blank slate, and just be willing to make the adjustments that are necessary to warm the Sony up to a decent level. Unfortunately, I didn't really look at video all that much, but what I did notice is that I shot in log settings on the A7 III a couple of times, and I got really good results there as well with the Cody Blue settings and the Josh Yo settings. So someone else will have to do that comparison, but my initial impression there is that the footage was quite usable. To sum it all up, with 4 different skin tones shot in 4 different lighting situations with 2 different brands of cameras, 3 different models of cameras really, I'm surprised. The Sony A7R2 wasn't as bad as I was expecting, but it wasn't as good as I was hoping. On the other hand, the Sony A7 III really surprised me. I was very pleased with the color tones I got, and overall I really enjoyed using the camera. Now, I may or may not end up with a Sony in the future, that remains to be seen, but the Sony A7 III is not a bad camera. And whether or not I end up with a Sony is really not contingent on color science, not anymore. It's contingent on a few other things, and I might talk about those in another video, but in the meantime, color science has kind of dropped to the bottom of the list in terms of my worries when it comes to the new generation of Sony cameras. Anyway, I hope this helped some of you out. I hope it explained some things for you, gave you a good baseline by which to make some decisions. If you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. But in the meantime, thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and we'll see you on the next video.